Let me welcome you again to this joint session of the World Leaders Forum and the conference on a new form of capitalism that's been organized with the University of Dauphine in Paris. We're really fortunate this afternoon to have a talk from George Soros. Most of you know a great deal about Mr. Soros, but let me talk about two things that you may not know. He is the author of 11 books, and many of these books have some very interesting ideas, both for changing ideas about how economies function and about the global political framework. One book that I had an opportunity to review was his book on globalization. One other important set of ideas is a set of ideas called reflexivity that's been in a number of his books. And his most recent book is his lectures at the Central European University, which he founded. The other thing is that Mr. Soros is, George is really probably the 21st century most important philanthropist. He began his philanthropy back in 1979 when he began providing funds to help black students attend Cape Town University in apartheid South Africa. He established a network of philanthropic organizations active in more than 50 countries around the world. These organizations are dedicated to promoting the values of democracy and open society. And more recently, George has been involved in trying to change something equally difficult, which is changing the economics profession, and in the creation of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, but also, more recently, also been in some of the work that he's most proud of is work on climate change in Indonesia. So without any further ado, let me ask George to come here.
Thank you. Two years have passed since the crash of 2008. I've written some books where I explained what happened then. I think it's time to bring the story up to date, and that's what I propose to do today. The theory I use is the same as in the previous books, so I won't repeat it here. The main points to remember are, first, that rational human beings don't base their decisions on reality, but on their understanding of reality, and the two are never the same. Although the extent of the divergence varies, and the variance is what really matters. This is the principle of fallibility. Second, the participants' misconceptions, as expressed in market prices, affect the so-called fundamentals, which market prices are supposed to reflect. And that's the principle of reflexivity. The two of them together assure that both market participants and regulators have to make their decisions in conditions of uncertainty. This is the human uncertainty principle. It implies that outcomes are unlikely to correspond to expectations, and markets are unable to ensure the optimum allocation of resources. These implications are in direct contradiction to the theory of rational expectations and the efficient market hypothesis. And markets basically just as prone to create self-reinforcing, initially self-reinforcing, but eventually self-defeating boom-bust sequences or bubbles, just as likely to do that as to tend towards equilibrium. So much for theory. Now for the actual course of events. In the crash of 2008, the uncertainties reached such an extreme that the markets actually collapsed. But that was a temporary phenomenon because the authorities intervened and managed to keep markets functioning by putting them on artificial life support. In retrospect, the momentary collapse may seem like a bad dream, but it was real enough, and 2 years later, we still suffer from its consequences. Let me explain why. When a car is skidding, you have to turn the wheel in the same direction as the skid to prevent the car from crashing. Only when you have regained control can you correct the direction of the car. And that's how the financial authorities had to deal with the crash. The underlying cause of the crash was the excessive use of credit and leverage. To prevent a catastrophe, they had to avoid a sharp contraction of credit. The only way to do it was to replace the private credit that had lost credibility with the credit of the state, which still commanded respect. Only after financial markets resumed functioning could they hope to reverse course and reduce the outstanding credit and leverage. This meant that they had to do in the short term the exact opposite of what would be needed in the long term. Now, the first phase of this delicate maneuver has now been successfully completed. Financial markets are functioning more or less normally, with toxic credit instruments replaced or guaranteed by sovereign credit. But the second phase is running into difficulties. Before the economy has fully recovered and unemployment has fallen, the credibility of sovereign credit has come into question. If governments are now forced to pursue fiscal discipline and tighten monetary and fiscal policy too soon, there is a danger that the recovery will abort. That is because the imbalances that have accumulated over a quarter of a century have not yet been corrected. The US still consumes too much, and China still is running an unsustainable export surplus vis-à-vis the United States. A similar imbalance prevails within the Eurozone, with Germany in the surplus position. In addition, the housing and commercial real estate bubbles in the US have not yet been fully deflated. And in the Eurozone, the banks have not yet been properly recapitalized. The deleveraging of the private sector is underway, but is far from complete. In the US, it applies to banks, corporations, and consumers alike. In Europe, it's heavily concentrated in the banking sector. Because the global imbalances still remain to be corrected, the question arises, how much government is too much, government debt is too much? And that's the central question confronting policymakers today. The discussion is eerily reminiscent of the 1930s. Then the fiscal conservatives, led by Andrew Mellon and Irving Fisher, were confronted by rebels like John Maynard Keynes. Now the division of opinion is more along national lines. The center of financial conservatism is Germany, while those who have rediscovered Keynes are located mainly in the United States. The clash of views has led to a drama which is unfolding differently in different parts of the world. The remarkable unanimity that prevailed in the first phase of the crisis and culminated in the $1 trillion rescue package that was put together for the London meeting of the G20 in April 2009 has dissipated, and political and ideological differences have arisen. Misconceptions are rampant. They complicate the matter enormously because it would require global cooperation to correct the global imbalances. I'll briefly review how the credibility of sovereign credit came to be questioned in various parts of the world, and then I shall address the question, how much debt is too much? Doubts concerning sovereign credit first reached a crisis point in Europe, and they revolved around the euro. But what appeared to be a currency crisis was in reality more a banking crisis and a clash of economic philosophies. The euro was an incomplete currency to start with. The Maastricht Treaty established a monetary union without a political union. The euro boasted a common central bank, but it lacked a common treasury. So even though member countries share a common currency, when it comes to sovereign credit, they are on their own. Unfortunately, this fact was obscured until recently by the willingness of the European Central Bank to accept sovereign debt of all member countries on equal terms at its discount window. This allowed the member countries to borrow at practically the same interest rates as Germany, and the banks were happy to earn a few extra pennies on supposedly risk-free assets by loading up their balance sheets with the government debt of the weaker currencies. For instance, European banks hold more than €1 trillion of Spanish debt, of which more than half is held by German and French banks. The large positions came to endanger the creditworthiness of the European banking system, depriving them of the capacity to add to their positions. Although it was the inability of the bank to continue buying the government debt of the heavy indebted countries that precipitated the crisis, it was really the introduction of the euro and the ECB's willingness to refinance sovereign debt that got the banks weighed down with these large positions in the first place. It led to a radical narrowing of interest rate differentials, and that in turn generated real estate bubbles in countries like Spain, Greece, and Ireland. Instead of the convergence prescribed by the Maastricht Treaty, these countries grew faster and developed trade deficits within the Eurozone, while Germany reined in its labor costs, became more competitive, and developed a chronic trade surplus. The discount facility of the ECB allowed the deficit countries to continue borrowing at practically the same rates as Germany, relieving them of any pressure to correct their excesses. So the introduction of the euro was indirectly responsible for the development of internal imbalances within the Eurozone. The first clear reminder that the euro lacked a common treasury came after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. The finance ministers of the European Union promised that no other financial institution whose failure could endanger the system would be allowed to default. But Angela Merkel opposed a joint Europe-wide guarantee. Each country had to take care of its own banks. At first, the financial markets were so impressed by the guarantee that they hardly noticed the difference. Capital fled from the countries which were not in a position to offer similar guarantees, pushing the countries of Eastern Europe, notably Hungary and the Baltic states, into difficulties. But interest rate differentials within the Eurozone remained minimal. It was only this year that financial markets started to worry. It was Greece that started the process when the newly elected government revealed that the previous government had lied about the deficit for 2009, and it was much larger than indicated. Markets panicked, and interest rate differentials widened dramatically. But the European authorities were slow to react because member countries held radically different views. Germany, which had been traumatized by 2 episodes of runaway inflation, was adamantly opposed to any bailout. France was more willing to show its solidarity. Since Germany was heading into elections, it was unwilling to act, and nothing could be done without Germany. So the Greek crisis festered and spread. When the authorities finally got their act together, they had to offer a much larger rescue package than would have been necessary had they acted earlier. In the meantime, doubts spread to the other deficit countries, and in order to reassure the markets, the authorities had to put together a 750 euro European Financial Stabilization Fund, 500 billion of which came from the member states and 250 from the IMF. The turning point came when China re-entered the market and bought Spanish bonds and the euro. So, under duress, the euro has begun to remedy its main shortcoming, the lack of a common treasury. The stabilization fund is very far from a unified fiscal policy, but it's a step in the right direction. Member countries are now a little bit pregnant, and they will be obliged to take additional steps. So the crisis has passed its high water mark, and the euro is here to stay. But it's far too early to celebrate because the emerging common fiscal policy is dictated by Germany, and Germany is wedded to a false doctrine of macroeconomic stability, which recognizes only the threat of inflation and ignores the possibility of deflation. This misconception is incorporated in the constitution of the euro. When Germany agreed to substitute the euro for Deutschmark, it insisted on strong safeguards to maintain the value of the currency. And that's how the ECB was given an asymmetric directive requiring it only to fight inflation. Moreover, the Maastricht Treaty contains a clause that expressly prohibits bailouts, and this has been reaffirmed by the German Constitutional Court. It's this clause that has made the crisis so difficult to deal with. This brings me to the gravest defect of the euro's design. It doesn't allow for error. It expects member states to abide by the Maastricht Treaty without establishing an adequate enforcement mechanism. And now, when practically all member countries have violated the Maastricht criteria, there is neither an adjustment mechanism nor an exit mechanism. And the countries are expected to return to the Maastricht criteria in short order. What's worse, Germany is not only insisting on strict fiscal discipline for the weaker countries, but it's also reducing its own fiscal deficit. When both creditor and debtor countries are reducing deficits at a time of high unemployment, they set in motion a deflationary spiral in debtor countries. Reductions in employment, tax receipts, and consumption reinforce each other and are not offset by exports, raising the prospect that deficit reduction targets will not be met and further reductions will be required. And even if budgetary targets were met, it's difficult to see how the weaker countries could regain their competitiveness vis-à-vis Germany and start growing again, because in the absence of exchange rate depreciation, they need to cut wages and prices, creating deflation. And deflation renders the burden of accumulated debt even heavier. Deficit reduction by a creditor country such as Germany is in direct contradiction of the lessons learned from the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's liable to push Europe into a period of prolonged stagnation or worse. That may in turn produce social unrest, and since the unpopular policies are imposed from the outside, turn public opinion against the European Union. So the euro, with its asymmetric directive, may endanger the social and political cohesion of Europe. Unfortunately, Germany is unlikely to realize that it's following the wrong macroeconomic policy, because that policy is actually working to its advantage. Germany is the shining star in the economic firmament. It dealt with the burden of reunification by reducing its labor costs, becoming more competitive, and developing a chronic trade surplus. And the euro crisis brought about a decline in the value of the euro. This favored Germany against its main competitor, Japan, and in the second quarter of 2010, the GDP jumped by 9% annualized. Germany believes it's doing the right thing. It has no desire to impose its will on Europe. All it wants to do is to maintain its competitiveness and avoid becoming the deep pocket to the rest of Europe. But as the strongest and most creditworthy country, it's in the driver's seat. As a result, Germany objectively determines the financial and macroeconomic policies of the Eurozone without being subjectively aware of it. And the policies it is imposing are liable to send the Eurozone into a deflationary spiral. But people in Germany are unlikely to recognize this because they are doing much better than the others, and the difficulties of the others can be blamed on structural rigidities. The German commitment to fiscal rectitude is also gaining the upper hand in the rest of the world. Angela Merkel went into the recent G20 meeting in the minority, and with the help of Canada and the newly elected Conservative British Prime Minister David Cameron, came out as the winner. Prior to the meeting, President Obama publicly appealed to Chancellor Merkel to change her ways. But at the meeting, the US sided with the majority and agreed that budget deficits should be cut in half by 2013. This may be the right policy, but it comes at the wrong time. The policies of the Obama administration are dictated not by financial necessity, but by political considerations. The US is not under the same pressure from the bond markets as the heavily indebted states of Europe. European debtor countries have to pay hefty premiums over the price at which Germany can borrow. By contrast, interest rates on US government bonds have been falling and are near record lows. This means that financial markets anticipate deflation rather than inflation. The pressure is entirely political. The public is deeply troubled by the accumulation of public debt. The Republican opposition has succeeded in blaming the crash of 2008 and the subsequent recession and persistent high unemployment on the ineptitude of the government, and in claiming that the stimulus package was largely wasted. There is an element of truth in this narrative, but it's far too one-sided. The crash of 2008 was primarily a market failure, a failure of the private sector. And the fault of the regulators was that they failed to regulate. Without a bailout, the financial system would have stayed paralyzed, and the subsequent recession would have been much longer and deeper. It's true that the stimulus was largely spent on consumption and didn't correct the underlying imbalances, but that was because of time pressure. As I explained earlier, the government was obliged to do in the short run the exact opposite of what is needed in the long run. Now, consumption still needs to fall as a percentage of the GDP, and fiscal and monetary stimulus are still needed to keep the GDP from falling and to prevent a deflationary spiral. Where the Obama administration did go wrong, in my opinion, was in the way it bailed out the banking system. It helped the banks earn their way out of a hole by supplying them with cheap money and relieving them of some of their bad assets. But this was an entirely political decision. On a strictly economic calculation, it would have been more effective to inject new equity into the balance sheets of the banks. But the Obama administration considered that politically unacceptable because it would amount to nationalizing the banks, and it would have been called socialism. That political decision backfired and caused a serious political backlash. The public saw that the banks earn bumper profits and pay large bonuses, while they were squeezed by the credit card charges jumping from 8% to nearly 30%. That was the source of the resentment that the Tea Party exploited so successfully in Boston. In addition, the administration has deployed the so-called confidence multiplier to restore confidence, and that turned to disappointment when unemployment failed to fall. The administration is now on the defensive. The Republicans are campaigning against any further stimulus, and they seem to be winning the argument. The administration feels that it has to pay lip service to fiscal rectitude, even if it recognizes that the timing may be premature. I believe that there is a strong case for further stimulus. Admittedly, consumption can't be sustained indefinitely by running up the national debt. The imbalance between consumption and investment needs to be corrected. But to cut back on government spending at a time of large-scale unemployment would ignore all the lessons learned from the Great Depression. The obvious solution is to draw a distinction in the budget between investments and current consumption and increase the former while reducing the latter. But that seems unattainable in the current political environment. A large majority of the population is convinced that the government is incapable of efficiently managing an investment program aimed at improving the physical and human infrastructure. Again, this belief is not without justification. A quarter of a century of agitation calling the government bad has resulted in bad government. But to argue that stimulus spending is inevitably wasted is patently false. The New Deal produced the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Triborough Bridge and many other utilities that are still part of our infrastructure. It's the Obama administration that has failed to make a convincing case. There are times like the present when we cannot count on the private sector to employ the available resources. The Obama administration has in fact been very friendly to business. Corporations operate very profitably, but instead of investing their profits, they are building up their liquidity. Perhaps a Republican victory will give them more confidence, but in its absence, investment and employment needs to be stimulated by the government. I don't believe that monetary policy can be successfully substituted for fiscal policy. Quantitative easing is more likely to stimulate corporations to devour each other than to create employment. We shall soon find out. This brings me to the question I posed earlier. How much room does the government have for fiscal stimulus? How much public debt is too much? This is not the only unresolved question, but it's at the center of political debate, and the debate is riddled with misconceptions. That is because the question doesn't have a hard and fast answer. In saying this, I'm not being evasive. On the contrary, I'm making an important assertion. The tolerance for public debt is highly dependent on the participants' perceptions and misconceptions. In other words, it's reflexive. There are a number of variables involved. To start with, the debt burden is not an absolute amount, but a ratio between the debt and the GDP. The higher the GDP, the smaller the burden represented by a given amount of debt. The other important variable is the interest rate. The higher the interest rate, the heavier the debt burden. In this context, the risk premium attached to the interest rate is particularly important. Once it starts rising, the prevailing rate of deficit financing becomes unsustainable and needs to be reined in. Exactly where that tipping point is located remains uncertain because it's dependent on prevailing attitudes. In other words, it's reflexive and therefore uncertain. Take the case of Japan. Its debt ratio is approaching 200%, one of the highest in the world. Yet, 10-year bonds yield little more than 1%. Admittedly, Japan used to have a high savings rate, but it has an aging and shrinking population, and its current savings rate is about the same as the US. The big difference is that Japan has a trade surplus and the US a deficit. But that's not such a big difference as long as China doesn't allow its currency to appreciate, because that policy obliges China to finance the deficit one way or another. The real reason why Japanese interest rates are so low is that the private sector, individuals, banks, and corporations, have little appetite for investing abroad and prefer 10-year government bonds yielding at 1% to cash at 0. With the price level falling and the population aging, the real return on such instruments is considered attractive by the Japanese. And as long as US banks can borrow at near 0 and buy government bonds without having to commit equity, and the dollar is not allowed to depreciate against the renminbi, interest rates on US government bonds may well be heading in the same direction. That's not to say that it would be sound policy for the US to maintain interest rates at 0 and preserve the current imbalances by issuing government debt indefinitely. Once the economy starts growing, interest rates will rise, and if the accumulated debt is too big, it may rise precipitously, choking off the recovery. But premature fiscal tightening may choke off the recovery prematurely. The right policy is to reduce the imbalances as fast as possible while keeping the increase in the debt burden to a minimum. This can be done in a number of ways, but cutting the budget deficit in half by 2013, while the economy is operating far below capacity, is not one of them. Investing in infrastructure and education makes more sense. So does engineering a moderate rate of inflation by depreciating the dollar against the renminbi. What stands in the way are misconceptions about budget deficits exploited for partisan and ideological purposes. I see a real danger that the premature pursuit of fiscal rectitude may wreck the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, George, for those comments. We have time for just a few questions. If you can line up at the two microphones. Go ahead.
What's the biggest misconception that the average person has about money?
The biggest misconception that the average person has about money.
Well, there's there are several, and there's the well-known money illusion. And there's also the misconception that the debt sovereign debt is somehow necessarily passed on from one generation to the next. If the economy is growing, then a growing deficit is not, or a growing debt is actually not an additional burden. Right now, I think it's this misconception that is dominating the debate.
Thank you. I was interested in an earlier part of your speech, and you talked about Germany as the conservative force, and that's exactly where I'm from. And I was wondering, what were the concrete steps that Germany should take to address the situation, in your opinion? Thank you.
What were the concrete steps that Germany should take
in
to correct its imbalances?
I think that it should not be reducing its budget deficit at the present time, and also should look for ways for stimulating the European economy altogether. The Germany's situation is very constrained by the requirement that it has to balance the federal budget by 2015 or 2018 in a number of years, and it has to move towards that balanced budget over time. And that is what is pushing the reduction in the deficit. And that is what makes it difficult to find some source of fiscal stimulus for the European economies as a whole. And I think, therefore, that fiscal stimulus has to be found within the European Union in one way or another. I think actually the issue of SDRs could be a very useful step in these circumstances, but that would require quite a bit of convincing.
Hello, Mr. Soros. I'm a business school student and a fellow philosophy major. In one of your lectures last year, you called for a clear distinction between financial markets and politics, but this distinction seems less and less clear these days. So would you say that what we have today is a political marketplace, and if so, what can we do about it?
It was the question of the interaction between politics and finance, and I think partly the excessive influence of finance in the political process in the United States. Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we have to recognize that generally speaking, misconceptions play a very, very important in shaping history. And it's particularly true in what you might call financial history. And false interpretations of reality exert a remarkably far-reaching influence. That is actually the reason why I'm sponsoring this Institute for New Economic Thinking, because economic theory, which has the status of science, is actually, I would say, built on false premises. So it's not astonishing, but it's important to understand how important these misconceptions are in shaping policies. It's so clear what the right policies ought to be, and yet politically they are not practical. And that's the situation at the moment.
Do you want to say any word about how what kind of reforms might reduce the influence of financial markets in our political process?
Well, that would require some. I think it would require actually a change in ethical standards, because it is generally accepted that special interests push for their to prevail in legislation, and legislators need money to get elected, and therefore they are very susceptible to that kind of pressure. And if you look at, for instance, the Financial Reform Act, it was really lobbied and defanged in the process. So it's really doesn't do the job that it's required to do. The point I would make in that respect, that while I stress that markets are imperfect because they are unstable and they need to be regulated, I should equally emphasize that regulations are even more imperfect because they are subject to political influences, and the regulators are bureaucrats, and bureaucrats are always slow to react to reality. Markets actually are much faster in adopting to reality than the regulators. So while you need to regulate, you also have to recognize that the regulations are bound to be imperfect and will constantly need to be revised in the light of current developments.
Thank you. Mr. Soros, I just had a question regarding the Bank of Japan. A little over 2 weeks ago, they decided to directly intervene into the currency market. And more or less, the free markets have been eroding away their appreciation. If you could offer your opinions about some alternatives about their currency.
So it was about Japan intervened in their exchange rate, and it hasn't been sustained. And do you want to comment on
Actually, I intend to comment at length on the currency issue in the next few days, because it's the other largely unresolved problem that's weighing currently on the global economy. The third one actually is banking is the regulation of the financial sector, which is not sufficiently coordinated. But I think that Japan was actually right in intervening unilaterally because it couldn't get international cooperation. And we are in need of a new Plaza Accord type of understanding between the major economic powers in the world on the relationship of currencies.
Hey, Mr. Soros. Basically, my question is, when it comes to the Obama administration, it seems like it's managed to alienate both sides of the domestic economic argument. It seems like the left wanted a bigger stimulus and thinks he brought too many people from that world on board in terms of his economic advisors. And the right, especially Wall Street, keeps saying that he's not creating a business-friendly environment. So how can he repair that image among both sides, or at least one side, and get something done?
So Obama's alienated both the left and the right. That he's too business and he's anti-business.
Yeah.
What can he do? Which can he save his position and save at least one of those two?
Yeah. Well, I think Obama finds himself in a rather awkward situation because his rhetoric has been very anti-business, while his actions have been very pro-business, and he's getting the worst of both these policies. Because he's accused of being anti-business, whereas in fact his policies have been very much to preserve the financial system, has been very successful in making the recession far shorter and shallower than it would have been otherwise, by actually invoking this confidence multiplier and reassuring the public that unemployment is going to fall and so on. And of course, when that didn't happen, then public opinion turned against him. And that is what makes his position at the present time so difficult.
What should he do now?
Well, I think that he ought to resist the extension of the Bush tax credits, and instead use the monies that would be collected to stimulate the economy through fiscal measures. Now, that I think is actually what is needed, because currently with the rebuilding of liquidity that is occurring everywhere, you do need this government stimulus to get the economy going.
Soros, would you mind sharing your opinion of and prediction for the economic governance package, which is making its way through the European Parliament at the moment?
The economic governance package making its way through the Parliament in Europe. I don't know that package.
I don't know what you.
Yes. It's the package that's been proposed by the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee about the sanctions for non-compliance with GDP to debt and...
The sanctions on European countries for non-compliance to enforce the Maastricht Convention, you know, so that they'll pay a penalty if they don't.
This is in compliance with the current construction of the euro, but as I tried to explain, this is pushing Europe into a deflationary stagnation or perhaps recession. And so you need to find some new sources of stimulation, which I think has to be Europe-wide, because the individual countries do need to engage in the structural reforms that are pressing. So the penalties by themselves would be okay. It's a lack of stimulus that is the problem.
Very much.
Hello, Mr. Soros. My question will consist of two parts. The first part, how do you think should there be any transformation applied to the concept of central bank independence? And the second part of the question, is there a risk of global hyperinflation in the current state of global financial system, which is overfilled of money printed during the crisis? Thank you.
Did you hear it?
Yeah, the first is your view on central bank independence, and the second is, with all the liquidity going in, is there a risk of hyperinflation in the long run?
Actually, the central banks are not quite as independent as they claim to be, which is a good thing. And we are currently face the reality of deflationary pressures and the prospect of inflationary pressures. So you have the fear of inflation and the reality of deflation. And that actually is what is weighing on the economy.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I'm sorry about that. Next time we'll get. So let me thank Mr. Soros again for a very stimulating discussion, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.